Chapter number 3 of the Life of Captain James Cook, the Circumnavigator, by Arthur Kitson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3, 1757 to 1759. HMS Pembroke. Cook joined HMS Solebay on the 30th of July 1757 at Leeds, where she was then stationed, but the date of his warrant has not been ascertained, although the public records and Trinity House have both been searched for the purpose. His stay was not long, for after a cruise of a few days she returned to Leith, and on the 17th of September Cook was superseded by John Nichols. In fact, his time on board was so short that his signature is not appended to any of the rolls. In April 1757, Mr. Bissett, who was master of the Eagle when Cook was master's mate, and who therefore would have a better chance than anyone else to measure his subordinate's character and capabilities, was appointed master of HMS Pembroke, a new ship, and superintended her fitting for sea. On the 26th of October he found himself transferred to the Stirling Castle, and it is only reasonable to suppose that, having formed a high opinion of Cook's work and knowing of his ambition to rise in the service, he would give information of the opportunity, and as far as he could, push forward his friend's interests. At any rate, the muster rolls show that in less than 6 weeks from leaving the Solebay, Cook was established on board the Pembroke as master, under a warrant bearing the date 18th of October 1757, and entered upon his duties on the 27th of October, the 29th anniversary of his birth, and from that date to his discharge into the Northumberland he signed the usual documents. At the time of his joining, the ship was fitting and victualling for sea at Portsmouth, and on the 8th of November she sailed for the Bay of Biscay, under the command of Captain Simcoe, returning to Plymouth on the 9th of February 1758. Louisburg. The British government had decided on making a determined effort to wrest the colony of New France from the hands of the French, and one of the few steps was to attempt the capture of the port of Louisburg, at the entrance of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, a place which the enemy were said to have rendered almost impregnable, at an expenditure of some £1,25,000. They looked upon it as second only to Quebec in its importance to the safe keeping of the colony. In order to carry out this design, a fleet was prepared under Admiral Boscawen, known to his men as Old Dreadnought, and from a peculiar carriage of the head, said to have been contracted from a youthful habit of imitating one of his father's old servants, Wry-necked Dick, to convey a small army under Major General Amherst to the scene of action. Boscawen sailed with his fleet, one member of which was the Pembroke, for Halifax, where they arrived via Madeira and the Bermudas on the 8th of May. Having completed his arrangements, Boscawen left Halifax on the 28th of May with 17 sail of the Royal Navy and 127 transports, picking up 2 more men of war and 8 transports just outside, and a couple more of the latter a few hours later. He had to leave behind at Halifax, with orders to rejoin him as soon as they were fit, several ships, the Pembroke being one, as their crews were so weakened by scurvy during the voyage from England. The Pembroke had lost 29 men, but was sufficiently recovered to be able to sail with 3 transports, 2 schooners, and a cattle sloop on the 7th of June, and arrived off Louisburg on the 12th. 4 days too late to take part in the landing which had been successfully carried out in the face of great difficulties caused by the roughness of the weather, the rocky coast, and the opposition of the enemy. In fact, James Wolfe, who was a brigadier throughout the siege, and on whose shoulders a very large portion of the work seems to have fallen, says, "Our landing was next to miraculous. There were 3 officers and 49 men killed, 5 officers and 59 men wounded of the army, 11 men killed and 4 officers and 29 men wounded of the navy, and 19 men wounded of the transport service. The weather was so bad that no stores or artillery could be landed for several days, the first gun being got ashore on the 16th, so Cook was in plenty of time to take his share in the difficult task of landing supplies, a task so dangerous that the fleet lost 100 boats in this duty alone." As well as forming the supply base for the army, the fleet also provided 583 men to act as gunners and engineers ashore, but none of these were from the Pembroke. The nature of the ground rendered the work of constructing the approaches and batteries extremely difficult, and it was not until the 20th of June that the first gun opened fire. Wolfe formed a battery on Lighthouse Point, one side of the entrance to the harbour, whilst the town was on the other side, with a fortified island in between, and the harbour held a French fleet which, at the time of the arrival of the British, consisted of 9 men of war. One escaped on the very day of the landing, and was shortly afterwards followed by 2 more. One, L'Echo, was captured by Sir Charles Hardy and taken into the British Navy, whilst the other, though chased for some distance, made good its escape to L'Orient with the first news of the siege. Previously to the coming of the British, 2 ships had been sunk in the harbour's mouth to render entrance therein difficult. 2 more were added to these, and then a 5th. One ship was blown up by a British shell, and setting fire to 2 others that lay alongside her. They also were destroyed. The fate of the other 2 is described in the Pembroke's log, kept by Cook, as follows: "In the night 50 boats, manned and armed, rowed into the harbour under the command of the captains F.R.S of the Hunter and Balfour of the Etna, in order to cut away the 2 men of war and tow them to the north-east harbour, one of which they did, viz. The Bienfaisant of 64 guns, the Prudent, 74 guns being aground, was set on fire. At 11 a.m. the firing ceased on both sides. The boats concerned in this attack, which Boscawen describes as a very brilliant affair well carried out, were a barge and pinnace or cutter from all the ships, except the Northumberland, which was too sickly, commanded by a lieutenant, mate, or midshipman, and Dr. Graham in his History of the United States of North America says, "The renowned Captain Cook, then serving as a petty officer on board of a British ship of war, co-operated in this exploit, and wrote an account of it to a friend in England. That he had distinguished himself may be inferred from his promotion to the rank of lieutenant in the Royal Navy, which took place immediately after." This statement that he was in the affair may be true, but there is no evidence on the point, and as he was a warrant and not a petty officer, and as his promotion did not take place for several years, Dr. Graham's story may well be doubted. It is believed that Cook did write to Mr. Walker from Louisburg, but the letter was one of those so unfortunately destroyed. The loss on this occasion to the British was very slight, there being only 7 killed and 9 wounded. The Bienfaisant, having been surveyed, was received into the Navy and given to Captain Balfour, whilst the command of L'Echo was conferred on Captain Laforey. In consequence of this success and the threat of an immediate assault on the town, the French commander, M. Drucourt, decided to surrender on the following day. This success was highly esteemed in England, and Admiral Boscawen, and General Amherst received the thanks of the Houses of Parliament. Wolfe and Hardy. After the siege, Wolfe wrote to Lord George Sackville, speaking in warm terms of Boscawen and his men, and says, "Sir Charles Hardy too in particular, and all the officers of the Navy in general, have given us their utmost assistance, and with the greatest cheerfulness imaginable. I have often been in pain for Sir Charles's squadron at an anchor off the harbour's mouth. They rid out some very hard gales of wind rather than leave an opening for the French to escape, but notwithstanding the utmost diligence on his side, a frigate found means to get out and is gone to Europe, charge de fanforenades. I had the satisfaction of putting 2 or 3 howitzer shells into her stern, and to shatter him a little with some of your Lordship's 24-pound shot, before he retreated, and I much question whether he will hold out the voyage." The Pembroke formed one of this squadron under Sir Charles Hardy, and after the capitulation of the town, was despatched with 9 other ships and a small body of troops under Wolfe to harry the French settlements around Gas Bay, as a preparation for the attack on Quebec it was intended to make in the following year. Several settlements and magazines were destroyed, 4 guns and a pair of colours were captured, and then the squadron returned to Halifax for the winter. Admiral Sir Charles Saunders was selected to command the fleet that was to be employed in this new movement against the capital of New France, a man of whom Horace Walpole wrote, "The Admiral was a pattern of the most sturdy bravery, united with the most unaffected modesty. No man said less, or deserved more. Simplicity in his manners, generosity and good nature adorned his genuine love of his country." With Durell's squadron. He left Spithead on the 17th of February 1759, with the intention of calling at Louisburg, the appointed rendezvous for the expedition, on his way to Halifax. But the season had been so severe that Louisburg, usually free from ice, was found to be unapproachable, so he went on, arriving at Halifax on the 30th of April. Admiral Durell had been sent out earlier from England, and was now despatched from Halifax with a squadron, of which the Pembroke was one, to prevent, if possible, the entry into the river of the usual spring fleet from France with supplies and reinforcements for Quebec, and to keep the French from putting up any fortifications on the Ile aux Coudres, thereby adding to the difficulties of the fleet in ascending this dangerous portion of river. The weather was bad, and the trouble caused by fog and ice so great that Durell found the fleet of 18 sail, convoyed by 2 frigates, had escaped him, but 1 or 2 small storeships were captured which proved of service to the British afterwards. On the way up the Gulf, Captain Simcoe of the Pembroke died, and the ship was given temporarily to Lieutenant Collins of Durell's ship, and afterwards to Captain Wheelock, who remained in her till after Cook left. Durell's squadron arrived off the Ile aux Coudres on the 25th, and on the 28th the Pembroke landed the troops she had on board, "as did ye rest of ye men of war," and they took possession of the island, which was found to be deserted by its inhabitants. The troops that were on board Durell's ships were under the command of Colonel Carleton, the Quartermaster General of the force, and Wolfe's great friend, whose services had only been obtained from the king with the greatest difficulty. Whilst awaiting the arrival of Saunders with the remainder of the expeditionary force, every endeavour was made to gain knowledge of the difficulties of the river, and Cook's log notes how the boats were out sounding ye channel of ye traverse, and on the 11th of June there is "returned satisfied with being acquainted with ye channel." The traverse here spoken of is that channel running from a high black-looking cape, known as Cape Tourmente, across into the South Channel, passing between the east end of the Ile d'Orleans and Ile Madame. It is still looked upon as one of the worst pieces of the river navigation. The British had some charts of the river showing the course taken by the French vessels, for in a note to the orders issued by Saunders on the 15th of May to the masters of transports, special attention is called to a plan or chart showing the route which His Excellency intends to make from Louisburg Harbour to the island of Bic, and this chart was most probably taken from one captured by Boscawen in 1755, and published in September 1759 by T. Kitson in the London Magazine, having the traverse shown on a larger scale. The sounding taken at the time Durell was waiting would be to verify those shown on this chart. After a short delay in Halifax, Saunders left for Louisburg to gather up the remainder of the forces and stores, and on his arrival still found the port hampered by ice. In fact, Major Knox, of the 43rd Regiment, relates that even so late as the 1st of June men were able to get ashore from their ships, stepping from one piece of ice to another. There was also another cause for dissatisfaction: delay in the arrival of the ships with soldiers and stores. Some of the troops had been directed to other work without any intimation to Wolfe, whilst others were in a very bad state from scurvy and measles. Some had lost their entire equipment, and it was with the greatest difficulty replaced. The supply of money was criminally small, and yet it is pleasant to read, on the authority of Major Knox, that I had the inexpressible pleasure to observe at Louisburg that our whole armament, naval and military, were in high spirits, and though, by all accounts, we shall have a numerous army and a variety of difficulties to cope with, yet under such admirals and generals, among whom we have the happiness to behold the most cordial unanimity, together with so respectable a fleet and a body of well-appointed regular troops, we have every reason to hope for the greatest success. Orders to transports. Before leaving, Saunders issued his instructions as to the order of sailing. He divided the transports into 2 divisions, the starboard flying a red flag and the larboard a white one. He assigned to each vessel its position and duties, and pointed out to each master of a hired transport that if the orders of his officers were not promptly and exactly carried out they would be fired on, adding with a touch of grim humour that the cost of the powder and shot so expended would be carefully noted and charged against the hire of the offending ship. On the 6th of June Saunders was off Newfoundland with 22 men of war and 119 transports, and the cold winds blowing off the snow-covered hills of that island were severely felt by the troops. On the 18th, when off the island of Bic, they were joined by Wolfe in the Richmond, and 5 days later, after picking up Durell at the Isle of Coudre. Here Saunders transferred his flag to the Stirling Castle, which he had selected in England for the purpose, owing to her handiness. Cook's friend Mr. Bissett was still on board, and leaving Durell with 11 of the deepest draught to guard against any interference from a French fleet, he proceeded up the river with the remainder. The work was hard, constantly anchoring and weighing to take every advantage of wind and tide, and the progress was slow. But at length the whole of the ships passed the traverse, and on the 26th the fleet anchored off St. Laurent on the Ile d'Orleans, and the troops were landed on the following day. Thus the much dreaded passage up the St. Lawrence had been carried out, and the fact that no loss of any kind had occurred to either man of war or transport reflects the very greatest credit on all engaged in the operation. Knox relates how the master of the transport he was on, a brother of Trinity House and Thames pilot, named Killick, refused the services of the French prisoner as pilot, and observing, "Damn, I'll show them an Englishman can go where a Frenchman daren't show his nose," took his ship up himself, chaffing the occupants of the marque boats as he passed, and in the end declared that it was no worse than the Thames. The wonderful success of their passage was emphasised the afternoon after their arrival at St. Laurent, when a heavy gale struck the fleet, driving several ships into collision or ashore, and causing considerable loss in anchors and cables. As soon as possible the men-of-war boats were out rendering every assistance, and all the vessels were secured but 2, which were too firmly fixed to be towed off shore, and these were soon afterwards burnt by the enemy. Fireworks. Thinking to profit by the disorder which must necessarily have been caused by the storm, the French made a determined attempt to destroy the fleet by means of 8 fireships, which were floated downstream on the unsuspecting British. Fortunately they were ignited prematurely, and the boats of the Pembroke and other ships were again out, employed in the hazardous task of towing these undesired visitors into such places as would permit them to burn themselves out without danger to the shipping. 6 were quickly got into safety, whilst the other 2 grounded and burnt out without causing further inconvenience. Captain Knox describes the scene as a display of the grandest fireworks that can be possibly conceived. The only result was to cause the retirement of a picket at the western end of the Isle d'Orleans, and the officer in command, who thought he was about to be attacked in force, was to have been tried by court-martial, but being advised to throw himself on Wolfe's mercy, was pardoned for his error of judgment. To guard against a repetition of such an attack, a system of guard boats, some moored across the river and some patrolling, was established, entailing considerable extra work on the sailors. An examination of the position showed Admiral Saunders that the safety of the fleet, and therefore the interest of the army, would be best consulted if he proceeded into the basin of Quebec, as to remain cooped up in the South Channel added to the danger if a further attempt should be made to fire the fleet. He therefore pointed out to Wolfe that the small battery established by the French on Point Levis, which threatened any ship entering into the basin, should be taken, and the point occupied. This was at once carried out by Monckton's brigade, and a battery was established which did serious damage to the town. When too late, the French sent over 3 floating batteries to aid in repulsing the English, but they were driven back by one broadside from a frigate Saunders moved up for the purpose. Montcalm had entrenched his army on the north bank of the St. Lawrence, between the rivers Charles and Montmorency, and Wolfe determined to seize on a piece of high ground to the east of the Montmorency, to form a camp there, and endeavour to force on a general action. In pursuance of this design, a body of about 3,000 men were landed successfully on the 9th of July, under the protecting fire of some of the fleet, and a camp was formed, and the next few days provided employment for the boats of the Pembroke and other ships in landing men, stores and artillery. The bombardment of the town opened on the 12th of July from the batteries erected at Point Levis, and a portion of the fleet continued with little intermission until the 13th of September. When fire was opened on the town, other ships in the basin and guns at the camp at Montmorency opened on Montcalm's line at Beauport. On the 18th, 2 men of war, 2 armed sloops, and 2 transports succeeded in passing the town without loss, but a third ship, the Diana, ran aground in trying to avoid collision with a transport, and was attacked by the enemy's boats, but was brought off by the Pembroke and Richmond. She was so seriously damaged that she had to be sent to Boston for repairs, and then returned to England. On the 20th Wolfe joined the up-river squadron in a barge, and in passing the town he had his mast carried away by a shot from the Sillery battery, but no further damage was done. He made a short reconnaissance which led to nothing at the time, but may have had an important influence on the choice of a landing place afterwards. Attack on Beauport. On his return to his camp at Montmorency, he decided to make an attack on the left of the French lines, from the boats and from his camp over a ford which was available at low tide between the falls of Montmorency and the St. Lawrence. This attack was to be supported by the Centurion, moored in the North Channel, and by 2 armed cats, which were to be run aground as near as possible to some small redoubts, the first object of the attack. Here it is certain that Wolfe and Cook came into personal contact, for on the latter fell the duty of taking the necessary soundings for the position to be occupied by the cats, and Wolfe refers in a dispatch to a conversation he had with Cook upon the matter. The attack took place on the 31st of July, aided by the fire of the Pembroke, Trent and Richmond, which were anchored clear over to the north shore before Beauport, a brisk firing on both sides. But the boats were thrown in confusion by a reef, marked on the chart as visible at low water, and were some time before they could effect a landing. Then a heavy storm of rain came on, rendering the ground, which was steep, very slippery. The troops occupied one redoubt, but was so dominated by the French musketry that they could get no further, and Wolfe deemed it desirable to recall them and to stop the advance across the ford. The 2 cats were burnt to prevent them falling into the hands of the enemy, and the losses of the English in killed, wounded and missing were 443, those of the French being estimated at 200. Cook says the repulse was solely owing to the heavy fire from the entrenchments, which soon obliged our troops to retreat back to the boats and Montmorency, whilst Wolfe, in a general order, throws the blame on the Louisburg Grenadiers, a picked body of men from several regiments, whom he considers got out of hand. He also, in a dispatch submitted to Saunders, threw some amount of blame on the Navy, but to this the Admiral strongly objected, and it was withdrawn. Wolfe saying, "I see clearly wherein I have been deficient, and think a little more or less blame to a man that must necessarily be ruined, of little or no consequence." It has been asserted that Cook led the boats to the attack, but as this was done by Wolfe himself, according to his own letters, and as Saunders was also out with them, both officers having narrow escapes, it seems more probable that Cook would be on his own ship, where, as she was engaged, his services would be wanted, for it was one of the master's most important duties to work her under the captain's orders when in action. A few days before this attack on Beauport was made, the French again paid the fleet the undesired attention of a large firecraft composed of several small vessels chained together and laden with all sorts of combustibles, shells, guns loaded to the muzzle, tar barrels, etc. And again this was grappled by the boats and towed away to a place of safety. And then Wolfe, sending in a flag of truce the next morning, said that if the performance were repeated, he should cause the instrument of destruction to be towed alongside 2 ships in which he had Canadian prisoners, and there let it do its worst. This somewhat cold-blooded threat was sufficient, and the experiment was not repeated. A narrow escape. During the time the fleet was occupying the basin, the masters of the ships were constantly out making observations and sounding, partly for the necessity of the fleet and partly to throw dust in the eyes of the French, and on one occasion Cook had a narrow escape from capture. His men had to row for it to get away from the enemy, and reaching the Isle of Orleans landed just in time, for as Cook, the last man, sprang ashore from the bows, an Indian boarded over the stern. The hospital picket turned out, and the French retreated. His friend, Mr. Bissett, was not so fortunate, being taken prisoner on the 7th of July whilst sounding in the North Channel. But he was either exchanged or escaped, for he is only absent from his ship for a few days. Wolfe, who was almost always ailing, had an attack of fever, and the worry of the repulse at Beauport rendered him incapable of duty for some days. He therefore laid before his brigadiers plans of future movements, asking their opinions and advice. These plans were not approved, but it was suggested that an attempt should be made to land on the western side of the town and there bring the enemy to action, and Wolfe writes, "I have acquiesced to their proposal, and we are preparing to put it into execution." The upriver detachment had been strengthened by the addition of a few more vessels, and Murray with 1,200 men had joined in an unsuccessful attempt to get at the French supply fleet, which had retreated to a place of safety. He had outwitted de Bougainville, who was detached to watch him, and succeeded in destroying a magazine containing clothing, powder, and other stores, and intercepted letters which told of the surrender of Niagara and the retirement of Bourlemaque upon the Ile aux Noix, to which place Amherst was preparing to follow. When Wolfe's resolve was taken to follow the advice of his brigadiers, Saunders again strengthened the force above the town, placing the squadron under the command of Admiral Holmes, and on the 3rd of September his boats withdrew the artillery and troops from Montmorency to Point Levis, and on the night of the 4th all the available boats and small craft were sent up, one of the last to pass being a small schooner armed with a few swivels and called by the sailors the Terror of France. She sailed by in broad daylight, drawing the fire of every gun that could be brought to bear on her, but was untouched, and anchoring close alongside the Admiral's ship, gave him a salute from the whole of her armament. The troops, which had been quietly marched some distance up the south bank from Point Levis, were taken on board the ships, the last detachment on the night of the 12th, and Admiral Holmes sailed up the river as if to beat up the French communications. But when night fell he returned, and the landing was successfully accomplished, and is described by Saunders in his dispatch as follows: "The night of their landing, Admiral Holmes, with the ship and troops, was about 3 leagues above the intended landing place. General Wolfe, with about half his troops, set off in the boats, and dropped down with the tide, and were by that means less liable to be discovered by the sentinels posted all along the coast. The ships followed them about 3/4 of an hour afterwards, and got to the landing place just at the time that they had been concerted to cover the landing, and considering the darkness of the night and the rapidity of the current, this was a very critical operation, and very properly and successfully conducted. In the meantime the ships in the basin, some 15 in number, distracted the attention of the French by a heavy cannonade on the Beauport lines, and the boats made a feint as if an attack were contemplated. Buoys had been laid in such a way as to lead to the idea that the ships were going to moor as close in as possible, as if to support an assault, and every effort was made to draw attention away from the movement up above. the Plains of Abraham. Lieutenant Norman of the Pembroke shortly describes the battle in his log. At 4 a.m. General Wolfe landed just below Cape Diamond with the whole army. At 8 the signal of boats manned and armed to go to Point Levy weighed and dropped air up. About 10 the enemy marched up and attacked General Wolfe. The action lasted not 10 minutes before the enemy gave way and run in the great confusion and left us a complete victory. Our army encamped on the plain aback of the town and made the necessary disposition for carrying on ye siege. Admiral Holmes hoisted his flag on board the Lowestaff, just off the landing place. In this action fell General Wolfe; of the enemy, General Montcalm and his 2 seconds. Cook does not mention the death of Wolfe, but says, "The troops continued the pursuit to the very gates of the city. Afterward they began to form the necessary dispositions for carrying on the siege." Cook is said by some writers to have piloted the troops to the landing place, and has even been set within hearing of the legendary recitation by Wolfe of Grey's eulogy. But as he was out with the Pembroke's boats in the basin at the time Holmes started up the river, and was probably on his ship, with his hands full driving the bombardment, and the recital of the eulogy at such a time was probably a myth. The traditions may be put down to imagination. The boats were piloted to the landing by Captain Chads of HMS Vesuvius. The town having surrendered 5 days after the battle, the movements made by Saunders in the basin no doubt aided Monsieur de Ramsay, the governor, in coming to a decision. General Murray was left with a garrison, and the fleet sailed for England, sending a detachment of the Northumberland and 6 others to Halifax with orders that Captain Lord Colville was to hoist the broad pennant as Commander-in-Chief of the North American station, and as soon as the season opened he was to return to the St. Lawrence to render support to any further movements made in Canada. Appointment to HMS Northumberland. Before the fleet left, however, Cook's connection with HMS Pembroke came to an end. Captain King, who was with Cook on his last voyage, writes to Dr. Douglas that he does not know the exact date of Cook's appointment to the Northumberland, but he was certainly master of that ship in 1758. Here King is in error, for Lieutenant James Norman of the Pembroke has the following entry in his log under the date 23rd September 1759. Mr. Cook, master, superseded and sent on board the Northumberland per order of Admiral Saunders. It has been said that Lord Colville made this appointment, but of course he could not do so, though he may perhaps have applied for Cook's services. But it is far more probable that the appointment was made by Saunders for the special purpose of having the survey of the St. Lawrence thoroughly well carried out. End of chapter 3.